The Odyssey is out in theaters, latest film from Christopher Nolan, cinematography by Hoyte van Hoytema, music by Ludwig Göransson. Cast includes Matt Damon, Tom Holland, Anne Hathaway, Robert Pattinson, Travis Scott, Corey Hawkins, Elliot Page, John Leguizamo, Mia Goth, Ryan Hurst, Benny Safdie, Himesh Patel, Logan Marshall Green, Charlize Theron, Zendaya, John Berntal, and Lupita Nyong'o. This is, of course, an adaptation of the Greek story credited to Homer about the Greek king Odysseus and his 10-year journey back home after the Trojan War. A few things of note that I wanted to discuss around the movie's production. One is the format. Famously, this is the very first ever full-length feature film shot entirely on IMAX film. What this means is it uses physical film in a very large 70mm format, meaning superb image quality, which you're able to blow up to these gigantic screens. The reason why any other previous film shot with IMAX cameras before has only used them in certain individual scenes is that the IMAX film camera is very large and very, very loud, meaning you couldn't shoot dialogue with it. It was so loud that you'd need to dub it in post-production, which is not the best process. But for the Odyssey, Nolan apparently approached IMAX and challenged the company to make him a new camera to be able to deal with this. And they did. Essentially, they managed to create a big soundproof box for the camera to sit in, eliminating the sound problem, but making the size issue even worse. Now you need 6 people to handle the camera in this blimp, as it's called. It is a pain in the ass to drag it into difficult terrain, and Nolan shoots on location. And also, it can only hold 3 minutes of film roll at the time, because the film itself is also rather large, so you need to frequently pause shooting and reload it. Also, when you're shooting close-ups, apparently the camera is so large that it's impossible for the acting partner to stand where he normally would. So in order to have the actor be able to act and see his partner, they had to devise a special mirror system. That's a lot of work. So you've shot the film, you have it, but that's not the end of the challenges. You need to edit it. In the case of physical film, part of the editing process is literally cutting and pasting the frames together. And part of it involves scanning the film onto a computer, doing the color grading there and special effects and other stuff, and then printing it back out onto the film to preserve the quality. Now, I admit at this point, I do get a bit lost in terms of how it all works, but again, sounds very complicated. So you're done with post-production. Well, now you have a whole other issue, which is how to actually screen the film. It's not just a question of an IMAX room. You need an IMAX film projector, and there aren't many of those. The last one was made back in 1970s, and there's a total of about 45 in operation right now around the entire world, with only 4 of them in Europe. They are a pain in the ass to operate. They weigh about a ton each, and you need a dual setup. The disc of film, the disc that you load the film onto, has a 2-meter diameter, and the film itself can weigh almost as much as half a ton, meaning that even the projection booth has to be designed specifically and correctly to support all this extra weight. So again, even though there are almost 2,000 IMAX branded theaters in the world, most of them are digital projectors with lower quality of image and smaller screens with the more panoramic proportions, meaning that in the case of 70mm film, you end up losing a little bit of the image on top and on bottom. All of this leads to an interesting question, which is, why would you make a gigantic blockbuster film on such a niche format, resulting in literally most of the world not being able to watch it as the director intended? For me personally, seeing it in a proper room would require travel to another country, as the closest true IMAX to me is in Prague. The answer is, of course, Nolan doesn't give a fuck, and he wants to do these things because he truly believes in its superb quality. And to be fair, he does seem instrumental in popularizing it. When Oppenheimer was coming out, there were only about 30 true IMAX theaters in operation. Now we're up to 45. Perhaps the number will grow in the future, but the main problem is the projectors are not being made anymore, so you'd need to find a couple of broken ones and combine the parts to make one working piece, which is how all the additional screening rooms have opened in the past couple of years. But that's, of course, a whole different story. The second aspect of the film's production is the so-called historical accuracy and the casting. Both of these subjects generated a lot of online discussion, a lot of online hate, I would also say. Some people complained about the armor and swords and helmets and clothes not being period accurate. Some disliked the modern English used in the theater, with Telemachus saying "my dad" instead of "my father." And some people cried about the casting of a black woman as Helen of Troy and a trans man as initially wrongly claimed he was Achilles. He is not, he's playing Sinan. So, in no particular order, regarding the casting, I think most of the discussion was being fueled by right wing morons and racists. My only problem was the somewhat modern American looking people like Matt Damon, like Zendaya, like Tom Holland, who just, you look at them and they don't scream ancient Greece to you. Regarding the armor and the clothes, I'm no expert, but initially was also slightly worried. And about the language, that was where I was also protesting the loudest. It didn't sit right with me, the modern sounding expressions. But what changed my mind about all of this, even before the movie's release, was an argument from a Homer scholar, which went something along the lines of, first of all, you can't really speak about historical accuracy in a story about made-up heroes, literal gods, monsters, and magic. It's a made-up tale. It would be like saying, Harry Potter doesn't have historically accurate costumes. What are you talking about? It's fantasy. But secondly, in its origins, Odyssey and the Iliad as well, were stories repeated out loud, not written down. It is presumed that even before they were first put down on paper, they have already changed and morphed and evolved over literal centuries. And at their core, these are not really meant to be stories about this particular event and this particular time period, but rather stories about certain people, certain types of adventures, and certain types of moral lessons that they take away from them. The reason that these stories remain relevant thousands of years later is because they can be reviewed and recontextualized in new light, but at their core, they contain some primal storytelling magic that still resonates with people. And changing the way someone's armor looks, or the race of one character, or the types of words they speak is not going to impact that in any way. In fact, these changes can be used to bring the heart of the story closer to the modern viewer. And by the way, final point about the language, and I and I suppose many others would expect a formal sounding British English being spoken in a historical epic, but that's just because we're used to that, because that was the film convention established for such a long time. If you think about it, I mean, obviously these characters didn't speak English at all. If you want to be historically accurate, again, historically accurate, you'd need all of them to speak Greek, and then you'd understand nothing. So to sum all of this up, after giving it some thought, I was ready to keep an open mind and see how Nolan actually executes the story. And this is where we come to the gist of it, which is that he executes it in a really, really interesting way. Because instead of a heroic tale, it becomes a reimagining, focusing on dealing with the trauma of war, grappling with your own sins and transgressions, being haunted by ghosts of those you've killed and those you've left behind to be killed. It's a story about how war fuels war and how heroes turn into boogeymen and how it's so difficult to go back to your old life after causing so much grief and hurt and breaking so many moral and ethical rules. It is about those ethical rules and about the consequences for not respecting them. And also, this is my read of it, I think it's also a film about an empire that used to paint itself as noble heroes and good guys, an empire who is now led by a greedy, violent man who starts a war for ostensibly moral reasons, really because of greed and imperialism, an empire that actually turns out to propagate war and suffering wherever it goes, that turns its own men into bloodthirsty monsters, an empire that violates established rules of trust and agreement, an empire that, as a result, is heading straight for its erosion and demise. And with that in mind, suddenly the all diverse, modern looking cast and the insistence of all characters speaking with an American accent makes that much more sense. If you think about it, you'll see the parallel drawn between the ancient Greece in this story and the modern day USA. And when that clicked for me into place, which was pretty early in the film, I was like, oh, okay, I can see where this is going and I like it. It is new. It is a new, unexpected direction, a new perspective on the well-known story, and I really, really like it. So, I liked the Odyssey thematically speaking. I liked its use of Athena and the final act reveal about her appearance. I liked how the Greeks are constantly shown to be killing first, asking questions later. I liked how Agamemnon is this gigantic black monster in a suit of armor until he suddenly isn't and is just a small naked man on his literal deathbed. I liked making it clear that Helen was never a true reason for war, just an excuse, and that Menelaus himself doesn't seem to really hold any love for her. I liked the climactic conversation between Odysseus and Penelope through the wooden divider wall. There are also other things I liked outside of that. I liked the Telemachus and Suitor subplot, which is tied to the main one by the idea of following or not following the law of the gods and the rules of hospitality. I love the horror sequence of Polyphem, the best scene in the movie for me, as well as the body horror sequence on Kirkes Island. I think the sacking of Troy is done fantastically, lit really well, scored unbelievably well, and finally revealing the horrifying truth about the extent of the Greeks' transgressions and war crimes. In terms of cinematography, on this point, I'm not exactly sure the hype and the format justifies the end film. Don't get me wrong, it is pretty, and having it be shot on location, on film, gives it that tactile, real look and feel. But at the same time, I have seen more visually impressive movies done with less, if you know what I mean. Music is great. Ludwig Göransson managed to make another banger of a score, particularly the theme playing over the already mentioned conversation between Odysseus and Penelope. He uses a lot of sort of weird Greek period instruments instead of a full orchestral score. So it sounds different than other movies. Performance-wise, Matt Damon is fine. I think Pattinson and Hathaway have the two best performances in the entire movie. They're excellent. Surprisingly, I like Tom Holland quite a lot. I think the role of a young, not quite confident, not quite capable, outmatched and outnumbered lad suits him well. There are things I didn't enjoy. I think that the dialogue is sometimes too on the nose, like the Athena's eyes line from Telemachus repeated about 500 times, or the closing lines of the movie about the end of the Bronze Age. That's just embarrassingly direct and unsubtle. I think that Penelope's line about how a woman can be king felt too modern day feminist for its setting. I also think that the big fight scene at the film's climax was somewhat underwhelming. The build up to it and the bow thing is incredible, but the fight itself is just average at best. I think the big storm sequence is, especially in an IMAX theater, just too loud and too exhausting. I mean, the constant flashing light and the noise just made my head hurt. I would also say that for how much the movie feels like it's about the sins done unto others, the resolution being mostly about honoring your own dead comrades, felt a bit like an evasive way to resolve this conflict, a too easy solution to this search for redemption. In fact, I'd say of all the Nolan movies, this might be my least favorite ending. But having said that, I still think it's overall a really good film and a superbly impressive technical achievement. Between the cameras and the locations and shooting on the sea and the practical effects with things like the Cyclops, it's really hard not to admire the ambition. I think the end film comes a tiny bit short of that ambition. It would be really hard to match it, honestly. But removed from its expectations, it's hard to argue against its quality. It is a splendid film, well worth watching on the biggest screen you can reasonably get to.